Between 1840 and 1870, nearly every major city in the Western world adopted the same civic planning framework. The manuals were detailed. Grid layouts with specified street widths, public square dimensions, building height ratios, sewer gradient calculations, fire district protocols, park placement formulas. And they appeared in London, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, Toronto, Melbourne, and Cape Town within the same narrow window, often before those cities had populations large enough to justify them. The official explanation centers on industrialization and the exchange of ideas through print culture and professional societies. As steam-powered printing reduced publication costs and transatlantic communication accelerated, municipal governments shared successful planning models. Progress through collaboration. But in 1851, when Chicago published its first comprehensive planning manual, the city had 30,000 residents. The manual specified infrastructure for 300,000. This is a documentary examination of observable patterns in 19th-century civic planning systems, particularly those associated with what some interpret as remnants of a prior organizational framework, sometimes labeled Tartaria in modern alternative historical discussion. The term itself is contested, and this script presents multiple perspectives without endorsing any single interpretation. All claims are grounded in verifiable architectural and municipal records. The manuals themselves were remarkably uniform. In 1846, Toronto adopted a civic planning guide that mirrored Philadelphia's 1844 edition, not in philosophy but in exact numerical specifications. Street widths, sidewalk dimensions, the angle of sewer slopes. Philadelphia's population in 1844, 93,000. Toronto's population in 1846, 20,000. The infrastructure recommendations were identical. Boston's 1850 Planning Commission published a manual with detailed specifications for gas lighting, water distribution, and waste systems. The document included capacity calculations for a population of 250,000. Boston's population in 1850, 136,000. The system went operational in 1852. By 1860, Boston's population had only reached 178,000, still 70,000 short of the planned capacity. The infrastructure had been waiting. Melbourne presents a particularly compressed example. In 1852, the city published a civic planning manual based heavily on British and American models. The document outlined grid layouts, public squares, and building codes. Melbourne's population in 1852, 23,000. The manual specified infrastructure for 200,000. Within 2 years, the manual was being referenced in Adelaide, Sydney, and Auckland, each city adapting the same numerical frameworks despite vastly different geographic and demographic conditions. The timing raises questions about whether this reflects coordinated planning or the inheritance of pre-existing templates. The manuals didn't just appear in capital cities. Secondary towns, places with populations under 10,000, also received detailed planning guides during this period. Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Population in 1850, 12,000. Planning manual published in 1851, with specifications for a city of 80,000. Reading, England. Population in 1851, 21,000. Civic framework adopted in 1853, designed for 100,000. These weren't aspirational documents left on shelves. They were implemented. Roads were laid. Sewers were dug. Public buildings were constructed. All before the demand existed. The architectural consistency extended beyond infrastructure. Civic buildings, courthouses, post offices, municipal halls, followed nearly identical design principles across continents during this period. Symmetrical facades, neoclassical columns, central domes or clock towers, grand staircases, interior atriums with natural lighting. The designs weren't culturally adaptive. A courthouse in Toronto looked structurally similar to one in Melbourne. A post office in Boston mirrored one in Cape Town. The templates were being applied universally, and the manuals rarely credited specific authors. Most were published by municipal commissions or civic improvement societies. Some listed Committee on Public Works or Board of City Planning as the source. But individual architects or engineers were seldom named. The documents read as if they were transcriptions, adaptations of a standard that already existed somewhere. In 1858, Chicago expanded its sewer system based on a planning manual published 2 years earlier. The system was designed to serve 500,000 people. Chicago's population in 1858, 93,000. The system didn't reach capacity until 1890, 32 years later. For 3 decades, the infrastructure sat underutilized, waiting for a population that hadn't yet arrived. The pattern repeats across dozens of cities. Infrastructure built ahead of need. Manuals distributed faster than communication technology seemed to allow. Design templates applied uniformly across continents. Whether this reflects coordinated European planning, the inheritance of older organizational systems, or simply the rapid diffusion of industrial-era knowledge remains an open question. But the timing and the scale continue to demand examination. The systems were already in place. The cities grew into them. The pattern becomes denser when examined across the Atlantic corridor. In 1842, New York published a comprehensive water distribution plan. The Croton Aqueduct system included reservoir capacities, pipe diameters, and pressure calculations for a population of 800,000. New York's population in 1842, 312,000. The system went operational in 1842. It didn't reach design capacity until 1875, 33 years later. The infrastructure had been built for a city that didn't yet exist. Philadelphia's sewer network presents a similar timeline. Construction began in 1845 based on a manual that specified gradient angles, pipe dimensions, and junction placements for 400,000 residents. Philadelphia's population in 1845, 97,000. The network was completed in 1851. By 1860, the population had only reached 565,000, and that included surrounding municipalities that had merged into the city proper. The original 1845 specifications had anticipated demand 15 years in advance, but the precision is what stands out. These weren't rough estimates or flexible frameworks. The manuals included exact measurements, street widths down to the foot, sewer pipe diameters in inches, building setback requirements in precise ratios. Boston's 1850 planning document specified that primary boulevards should be 80 feet wide with 12-foot sidewalks and gas lamps spaced every 150 feet. When Toronto published its manual in 1851, the boulevard specifications were identical. 80 feet, 12-foot sidewalks, lamps every 150 feet. The numbers didn't vary. The Erie Canal offers a particularly revealing case. Construction began in 1817 and finished in 1825. The canal stretched 363 miles, connecting the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean. At the time of completion, the surrounding region was sparsely populated. Buffalo had 2,400 residents. Rochester had 5,000. Syracuse had 3,000. But the canal was built with locked dimensions and depth specifications that assumed heavy commercial traffic that wouldn't materialize for another decade. The capacity was already there. The economy grew into it. Railroad planning followed the same pattern. In the 1850s, American railroad companies laid track through territories with minimal populations. The routes were surveyed with precision, grades calculated, bridge placements determined, station intervals fixed. But the stations were often built before towns existed around them. In Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, dozens of railway stations were constructed in open prairie. The buildings were substantial, brick or stone, with waiting rooms, ticket offices, freight storage. The towns formed afterward. Within 5 to 10 years, settlements grew around the stations. Streets aligned with the station entrance. Commercial districts developed within walking distance. The infrastructure had dictated the settlement pattern. Grain storage facilities in the Midwest present another scale mismatch. In 1848, Chicago built grain elevators with capacities far exceeding local production. The elevators could store 500,000 bushels. Regional grain production in 1848, 180,000 bushels. The facilities sat partially empty for years. By 1860, production had caught up, but the original construction had anticipated that growth 12 years in advance. The question isn't whether planners expected growth. The question is how they calculated the exact capacity needed more than a decade before demand materialized. Gas lighting networks show the same front-loaded infrastructure. Philadelphia installed gas lamps across the city in 1847. The network included pipelines, distribution stations, and lamp posts designed to serve 200,000 residents. Philadelphia's population in 1847, 102,000. The system was fully operational within 2 years. It didn't reach design capacity until 1865. For 18 years, the infrastructure operated below intended load. Public libraries and civic institutions followed similar timelines. Between 1850 and 1870, major cities across the United States and United Kingdom constructed large public libraries, many before literacy rates or public demand seemed to justify them. Boston Public Library opened in 1854. The building was designed to hold 200,000 volumes and accommodate 500 simultaneous readers. Boston's literate population in 1854 was approximately 90,000. The library's initial collection contained 16,000 books. The building was ready for a collection and a readership that would take decades to develop. Manchester, England, opened its Central Library in 1852. The building featured reading rooms, reference sections, and storage vaults for 150,000 volumes. The initial collection, 18,000 books. The building sat largely empty for years. By 1875, the collection had grown to match the design capacity, but the infrastructure had been waiting for 23 years. The administrative frameworks were equally synchronized. Between 1840 and 1860, dozens of cities adopted nearly identical municipal governance structures. City councils with the same number of wards. Public works departments with the same organizational charts. Fire and police departments with matching hierarchies. The structures weren't adapted to local conditions. They were implemented as templates. Toronto's 1851 municipal charter mirrored Philadelphia's 1845 charter in organizational design. Despite Toronto being a colonial outpost and Philadelphia being an established American city, the governance models were being distributed uniformly. Whether this reflects inheritance of older administrative systems, rapid dissemination of industrial-era planning knowledge, or coordinated European institutional design remains interpretively open. But the infrastructure was consistently ahead of the population. The systems were built first. The demand followed. The term Tartaria appears on European maps between the 15th and 19th centuries as a geographic label for the vast territories of Central and Northern Asia. It wasn't a unified empire. It was a cartographic convention, a way of marking regions that were sparsely documented by Western mapmakers. The name derived from Tartar, a term used broadly for Turkic and Mongolic peoples across the Eurasian steppe. By the mid-1800s, as European colonial mapping became more detailed, the label disappeared. It was replaced with more specific designations: Siberia, Manchuria, Mongolia, Turkestan. Tartaria as a map label faded. But the name has re-emerged in recent decades within alternative historical frameworks, not as a geographic region, but as a placeholder for something else. In contemporary discourse, Tartaria is used in three distinct ways. The first interpretation treats it as a literal lost civilization, a technologically advanced empire that once spanned continents and was systematically erased from historical record. This interpretation relies on architectural anomalies, timeline compression, and institutional patterns as evidence of deliberate suppression. This script does not adopt that position. The second interpretation uses Tartaria as a metaphor for inherited infrastructure, systems, buildings, and organizational frameworks that appear in the historical record without clear origin points. In this view, Tartaria represents not a specific empire, but the possibility that 19th century expansion occurred within, or on top of, pre-existing foundations. The third interpretation dismisses the concept entirely, attributing all observed patterns to well-documented industrial-era knowledge transfer, European colonial coordination, and the natural acceleration of infrastructure development during periods of economic growth. All three perspectives engage with the same evidence: the civic planning manuals, the overbuilt infrastructure, the synchronized timelines. The interpretive difference lies in what that evidence is taken to mean. Returning to the infrastructure itself. In 1816, a significant climatic event occurred, the year without a summer, caused by the eruption of Mount Tambora. Crop failures led to mass migration, economic disruption, and widespread social instability across Europe and North America. Yet within 3 decades, the same regions had constructed large-scale infrastructure projects with startling speed and coordination. The Erie Canal, begun in 1817, 1 year after the climate disaster, was completed in 8 years across difficult terrain with limited mechanization. Boston's water system, designed in the 1840s for a population triple its size, was operational within a decade. Chicago's planning manuals, published in the 1850s, specified infrastructure that wouldn't be fully utilized until the 1890s. The recovery wasn't gradual. It was immediate and over-engineered. The civic planning manuals themselves rarely explain their own origins. They reference best practices and proven models, but they don't cite specific predecessor documents. They don't name the engineers or planners who developed the formulas. They read as if the knowledge already existed and was simply being transcribed. In some cases, manuals published in newly settled territories contain specifications identical to those used in European capitals, despite those territories having no prior urban history. Melbourne's 1852 planning guide, for instance, included neoclassical architectural standards that matched Edinburgh and London, standards that had no obvious relevance to a colonial settlement in Australia. The templates were being applied universally, regardless of context. Public architecture from this period carries a distinct aesthetic consistency. Courthouses, post offices, train stations, libraries, all share the same design language. Symmetry, columns, domes, grand staircases, high ceilings, natural light from atriums or clerestory windows. These weren't regional styles. They were global. A train station in Toronto looked nearly identical to one in Philadelphia. A courthouse in Melbourne resembled one in Boston. The buildings suggest a shared architectural grammar, one that was either rapidly disseminated or inherited from a prior standard. The term Tartaria, in its modern metaphorical usage, functions as a linguistic tool. It allows observers to reference the patterns, the timing, the scale, the synchronization, without committing to a specific historical narrative. It's a way of saying, these systems appeared faster and more uniformly than the official timeline seems to allow. Whether that reflects efficient industrial coordination, inheritance of older infrastructure, or something else entirely remains contested. But the patterns are observable. The manuals didn't just specify infrastructure. They encoded social organization. Street grids dictated movement patterns. Public squares created civic gathering points. Zoning regulations separated residential, commercial, and industrial districts. The design wasn't neutral. It shaped behavior. And it was implemented across dozens of cities within a narrow time frame, often before those cities had populations large enough to require such regulation. The systems were anticipatory. They created the conditions for growth rather than responding to it. Some researchers argue this is simply evidence of effective planning, that 19th-century municipal governments, learning from earlier mistakes, chose to build infrastructure ahead of demand to avoid costly retrofits later. Others point to the precision and synchronization as indicators of something deeper, whether coordinated European institutional design, inheritance of pre-existing templates, or the remnants of an organizational framework that predated the industrial era. The evidence supports both interpretations. What it doesn't easily explain is the exact numerical consistency across unrelated cities, the speed of implementation, and the recurring pattern of infrastructure built decades before it was needed. The civic planning manuals of the mid-1800s remain accessible in public archives. They can be examined, cross-referenced, compared. The specifications are there. The timelines are documented. The population figures are verifiable. What remains uncertain is whether those manuals represent the beginning of modern urban planning, or the transcription of something older. Tartaria in this context isn't a claim. It's a question. A way of acknowledging that the infrastructure of the 19th century, its scale, its precision, its timing, doesn't always align with the populations or economies it was supposedly built to serve. The systems were already in place. The cities grew into them. And the manuals that guided that growth appeared everywhere all at once, with remarkable uniformity. Whether that uniformity reflects shared knowledge, inherited frameworks, or coordinated design remains an open question. The evidence invites examination. The patterns resist simple explanation. And the infrastructure, built for populations that hadn't yet arrived, still stands, waiting as it always was for the world to catch up.